Well, thank you to the organisers, and thank you all for coming and giving me the opportunity to rant about shapes. And so there's very few slides. Most of it's going to be on the board. But this slide is to remind me to recognise my collaborators. Don't want to forget that. So this was a project that started many years ago when I visited Duke. And Cheyenne said, surely persistent homology can be used to compare shapes. Surely. And he knew Doug, also at Duke, but in a different department, obviously. And he had bones, and he'd like to compare the bones. He'd want a number out of it. And he thought persistent homology would be the way. And we came up with this thing called persistent homology transform. It's a very simple concept, but we, prove various properties about it. And you could use it to compare shapes. More recently, with Justin Curry and Cheyenne, we've sort of rejuvenated the project and tried to give some more theoretical results about the persistent homology transform. Okay, so with no more ado, I will continue on to... I had one more slide before it was meant to go black. One more slide. Okay, well, I'll tell you a bit about Doug. There we go, Doug. Doug is an evolutionary anthropologist. So Jacket, who's gone now, but he also worked with evolutionary anthropologists at Duke, and the point of evolutionary anthropology is to study, it's like an interdisciplinary study, and it's meant to compare humans and primate ancestors of humans. You're trying to study them from a physiological point of view, a behavioural point of view, that sort of genetic point of view. It's very sciencey. It's not social science, it's science. And one of the things you can do is you can study the shapes of bones. And in the case we were caring about, it was heel bones. And this should be related to various things like, are you in a tree? The shape of your heel would relate to whether you walk or you climb or whatever. 2 legs, 4 legs, that sort of thing. So it's nice to be able to compare the shapes of bones to other things like how close genetically you are, or where on the family tree you are. Okay? So that was the data set we were working with. We had 106 different bones, and we wanted to just be able to say, give me a pair of bones, how different they are, give me a number. That was the goal. All right? And the goal is to use persistent homology, and it will magically turn black now. Oh, except for a thing, but that's okay. And I'm going to now just sort of set the scene with some classical shape statistics. So I'm going to oversimplify an entire subject, so please forgive me and forgive it. I will leave that up. And Jacket kind of gave this sort of description earlier, but I'm going to give it again. And the idea is I have 2 different shapes, and because I'm a mathematician, they're going to be blobs. But to a biologist, these blobs will mean something. And they'll go along and they'll say, this point here, that's definitely point A. All right? And this point here, that also is definitely point A. And then I'm going to think, there's some point B here. This point B is really important. That is B. That B is really important. They'll probably have actual names for what these things are biologically. But they'll go along and they'll label a bunch of points. So in the teeth, there were 16 points and they were different colours. In our case, there were 20-something points, and I have no idea what their biological meaning was, but I know that some expert had to sit down and look at them and make a decision. And there's various problems with this whole sort of pipeline, in that you need someone to do it, or them to have students, or in the case I've seen sometimes, online crowdsourcing of people labelling points, which slightly worries me. And then you have this issue that if 2 people did it, would they give the same points? And whenever you do this, you lose information. So say these are my 3 points. I mean, in classical shape statistics, you reduce this entire shape to these 3 points. And I compare these 3 points to these 3 points. I've lost the curve. So it would be nice to use the whole curve in our analysis. Now, in persistent homology, there are many ways, given a curve, that you could compute persistent homology, which we are prone to do. And the way that we were wanting to do it is not a distance function, but the sort of height function version. So I'm looking at the height of these things. So here's my lovely curve, okay? And I'm going to take a height function, and I'm going to use this one because it's got more interesting things happening. I'm going to take this height function in this direction here, okay? Being all controversial and going at an angle. And I see that stuff happens here, that goes forever, there's something here, it lasts for a little bit, and then here, that goes on forever as well. Yeah, that's flat enough that nothing else happens there, okay? So you can see that I've created this persistence diagram. I've drawn the bars, but hopefully people can translate, which captures geometric information from this direction. Now, I've also lost in it a lot of information, and I've also made an arbitrary choice. I've picked this direction. But thankfully, we had a solution to this, and the philosophy is one diagram good. I'm not going to write many words in this talk. More diagrams better. Okay? And if you take nothing else from the talk, take that box. Okay? So I've taken geometric information in this direction. There's no reason why I can't also do it from this direction, and all those sorts of directions. Take it from all directions. And in theory, when I do that, this will come out of my hair, I will see the shape from all directions. All right. So this will be the way we will define our persistent homology transform.
If you're talking about a heel bone, right, presumably the vertical direction is not one of the ones you tilt here, only tilting in the circle.
No, we do the whole sphere. There's no reason why you can't do a variation on this. And this is certainly something that I would be interested in doing. You know, what happens if you take a subset of the directions in a particularly interesting way? What information do you keep? What information do you lose? Thank you for preempting the end of my talk. You read this at some point, yeah. In theory. All right, so I'm not going to do this for any old shape. I'm going to have a shape, and I'm going to assume it's reasonably nice. And by reasonably nice, I'm going to say it's compact and that it's semi-algebraic. So I've got some subset of Euclidean space that is not too bad, so at least things will be defined. And then I say that the persistent homology transform, which I will from now on just write the initials, PHT, it's going to be a map that goes from the d-1 sphere into my space of diagrams to the point to power of d. So d is the space of diagrams. Or you could do barcodes, or you could do other topological summaries if you want, such that I take my direction v, my unit vector, and then I put out a tuple which corresponds to the persistence diagrams for that height function. So I'm just going to write, can people read this or is it too tiny? Okay, so here I'm looking at the persistent homology of M with the height function in direction V. Okay, hopefully it's relatively intuitive notation so I don't have to define it. But stop me if anything is undefined enough to be confusing. If it's undefined but not confusing, then that's all right. It could just be misinterpreted and then become new, interesting research. There are a couple of other things that are related variants on the same theme. So I can have a 0th dimensional version. Okay, which I'm going to just put a little 0 in. It's going to be if I just remember, the 0th dimensional diagram and don't have the rest. So V goes to just 0th dimensional persistent homology. Okay? And the great advantage of this is it's much easier to compute. Much faster, much easier. Okay? And then the other thing we've got is the Euler curve. So the Euler curve transform. Oops. Is there longer chalk? Yeah. Oh, there's colours. Didn't use that. Where, again, I do each direction, and then I just take the Euler curve for M. So we have the T goes to the Euler characteristic of the sublevel sets in direction M. If you don't know what this is, you just ignore it and just think of persistent homology, but the idea is that this is an even easier to compute thing where you're just keeping track of the Euler characteristic of the sublevel sets. Okay? So, we define this thing, and we want to be able to use it, so we should check that it's reasonably well behaved. So, the first thing we prove, which surprised Shmuel when I first told him, I'm very glad to have at once caused surprise, which is that it's injective. Okay, so to be a bit more sort of concrete is that if M1 and M2, we've got these are in RD, compact, semi-algebraic, then if they're persistent homology transforms are equal, then they are equal. Okay, and it turns out that it's also true if you use the Euler characteristic curves. So if they're equal, then the same, they're also equal. I mean, this is weaker than that. And as a historical note, with Cheyenne and Doug, we did it for finite simplicial complexes in R2 and R3. And then with Justin and Cheyenne, we now have the more general result. So I guess that's the new thing. Was that a question? No? Okay. The other... Oh, whoops, sorry. Thank you. I was on autopilot while talking. That should be correct now. Good. The other injectivity result we have, which is almost a corollary rather than a... is that if you're in a special case, a pretty common special case in applications is if we have M1, M2 homeomorphic to S2. So if you have something homeomorphic to S2, they're both lying in RD, okay, then we don't need to use the whole thing. We can just use the 0th dimensional one. So this has the advantage that if you've got something like a bone, I mean, the way we have a bone, you could say, oh, that's a solid thing. But the way we're given a bone is actually, for us, was a triangulation of its boundary. And I think that's reasonably common. You know, you don't really care about the whole bone so much. You're thinking about the sort of the outside of it. And so for all those sorts of things where you have this contractible shape, you can think of its boundary as being homeomorphic to S2, and that will let you go through this. The proof of this sort of piggybacks off other things. So for one, it piggybacks off this. And the other thing it piggybacks off is Alexander duality. So if you use that with the idea that cohomology and homology give you the same persistence diagrams, you can get this from this.
So you're in R3 here?
Nope, these are in RD. No, this is to S2. Because what happens is that from H0, the persistent homology of H0, you can get the persistent cohomology of H1 in the opposite direction. And so that means that from the 0th dimensional diagrams, you can get the 1-dimensional diagrams. You can also get the 2-dimensional diagrams because it's the sort of essential class in the opposite direction. So it very much relies upon the homeomorphism type. In fact, I haven't defined a distance yet, but the distance between these ones will be half the distance between the full ones, once I'd defined a distance. So the statistical properties are identical. So there's really no advantage of going beyond the 0th dimensional one. Okay.
Examples where H0 is not enough?
If I had a torus, because I would never see the middle of it. I cannot see the middle of my donut because I only ever see that from the birth of H1 classes. Is that, yeah?
So strictly speaking, so you're saying that you have a donut and the convex hull donut, that those have the same pH0 transforms? So that you, and in particular, that would be an example where you M1 and then...
Not strictly speaking, I could find a donut who's not got the same as the thing. So if I had a donut where I had, here is my outside and then my... Well, I'm going to be in some high-dimensional space, so I could just poke out a bit different. Oh, can I poke out from the inside? I'd have to think about that.
Yeah. You can see higher dimensions.
Yeah. So I'm glad I didn't try to, draw too hard. Okay. I'll leave the def up. Why not? Okay, so objectivity, metrics. Okay, so within a TDA, we have various different, metrics we can pick between different topological summaries, and we're going to use that to create a distance between the sort of original shapes that created this whole process. So the distance of choice here is 1 Wasserstein distance between the persistence diagrams. So let's remind ourselves how this goes. So if I have X, Y persistence diagrams, okay, I can then make the 1 Wasserstein distance between them as being the shortest distance, the shortest cost of moving every point to every other point. So I look at all my bijections between the points in X to the points in Y, and then I sum up the distances we need to go, and I take the L1 distance here. Okay, there are other choices you could make. In practice, this seemed to work better because it meant that the persistence diagram points that you matched up would correspond to the same feature in the shape, if that makes sense. Like if I had a bump here and I'm looking at it in this direction and in this direction, I'd like to be comparing the points in the persistence diagrams that are, I'll ignore that, don't worry. So Michael did this in his talk, but I'll just redraw. So you have your cross diagram, you have your square diagram, and you look at the different ways you could match the points, the crosses and diagonal, with the ways you can match the square with the diagonals, and you pick the cheapest way, and that's your cost. So I match these together, and I add this cost. I match these together, I add that cost. I match this together, this. So I got a lot with diagonal, but that's okay. And so the distance between these two diagrams is just adding up all those distances. Okay? Now, if I have that for one direction, so remember, if I've got a direction v, I'm looking at my shape from direction v, I can say, well, the distance between bone 1 and bone 2 in direction v is this. If I want to do the whole bone, I'll just integrate over the whole sphere. So I will push this forward through, so I'll make my distance from one shape to another shape to be sum over dimensions, integral over directions, and then I do my distances between the appropriate diagrams. Running out of 1 and 2. Okay, so this just means for every direction, I get a distance. This will give me a function over the sphere. I integrate over the sphere. Okay, I could do other options. I could put p's, decorate with p's and q's or whatever, but this is the one we used. We can also, so this would be the persistent homology transform one. We could also do the 0th dimensional version, where we just do the 0th dimensional homology. And this is something that, just pointing to where Shmuel was saying, there's no reason why you have to use the whole sphere. If we were interested in a particular problem where going round made sense, you could just look at a subset of these directions and do the integral over that subset. It would be interesting to know which shapes get confused under such circumstances. Okay. And as I mentioned earlier, in the case of of M1 and M2 homeomorphic to a sphere, this is going to be half that. Okay. So, obviously in an application, we're not going to integrate over the whole sphere. We're not going to do that. What we're probably going to do is do some approximation of that by, say, doing so many directions, and then you might interpolate, or you might just take the average over the finite directions you have, which is the lazy person's version, and the version we did. You could do smart things with the numerical analysis, but since I was doing the coding, it didn't happen. I'd probably make a mistake and it will give the wrong answer anyway. So what we need is some sort of justification for being able to take finitely many directions and use that as our approximation. And thankfully that's fine, because PHKMHV is Lipschitz. Is there no? In V for reasonable M. I'm deliberately being vague here, but it's not unreasonable, because if I shift my direction slightly, my height function over M doesn't change much. And normal stability for persistent homology comes to the rescue. Okay? So this means that we can approximate the distance between the things with finitely many directions. Okay. There are other sorts of stability results you could expect or hope for, such that if you changed your M slightly, the distance shouldn't be much. I will leave that mainly as conjecture. Certainly it's not true that if you change it by a Gromov-Hausdorff close that the stability will hold, because we're wanting our height function to vary slightly, not for the shape itself to vary slightly. Does that make sense? If you add a bubble somewhere, you're screwing yourself up. So, you know, you have to change what your definition of close is to what most applied topologists are used to. Okay. What have I got next? All right, I think I'm ready for slides. All right, so there are certain things I can't draw. You saw my drawing skills weren't that great. So, come on. Okay, enter password. All right, magically a slide will appear. There we go. So we did compute these distances on a bunch of different examples. There we go. So the first example we did was more of a sanity check than anything else. So if we get a classical family of shapes, we want the distances between the persistent homology transforms to kind of reflect differences in the original sort of parameterized family. Okay, so we've got a parameterized family here where I've got ellipsoids, nice, happy, centered ellipsoids, and I can stretch them in the 3 different coordinate directions. So I've got a 3-parameter family of shapes here. And the question is, how do the distances between these things relate to the A, B, and C? Okay, because if they're not related, it's a bad distance. Thankfully, they are related. And I will mention here we use the 0th dimensional persistent homology for this all because it's a nice, happy, homeomorphic to a sphere problem. So we computed all these pairwise distances for a bunch of different choices of A, B, and C, and then you get a pairwise distance matrix. And there's this thing called multidimensional scaling, shortened to MDS, which is quite standard within the world of statistics, where you look at the best projection which will preserve the pairwise distances. So this is a way for us to be able to visualize by projecting into Euclidean space. So each of these dots here corresponds to one of the ellipsoids. And the MDS coordinate 1 means the first coordinate that ellipsoid was sent to when we did this projection into Euclidean space from shape space. Okay, ellipsoid shape space into Euclidean space preserving these distances. Okay, and the bottom one here I've described as the size of the ellipsoid, which was it's a number we got by taking an integral of the convex hull, sort of approximating size of things. Okay, and it turned out that this sort of volume-like, it's not quite volume, but this volume-like number was highly correlated with the first coordinate. And the second coordinate, if you see these tiny, tiny little numbers, basically told us in which direction, second and third coordinates, basically told us in which directions were we more spread out. Okay, so you can see a lot of symmetry here, and the very middle is where all the spheres went. And then as you go out in these different sort of 6-fold directions, you're looking at which ones are larger than others. You know, is my X larger, or is my Y larger, or is my Z larger? Okay? So it seems, the sanity check seemed to say that there was some sort of geometric properties that were being reflected in these distances. Okay? The other thing that we did, and no one harassed me about this, which was kind of fortunate, because if you talk to an applied crowd, this is the first thing they ask you. They say, but what if they're unaligned? Because most things are unaligned. You've just got these random things. And for us, the easiest solution was, well, let's just take the answer you get when you have the best possible alignment. So by best possible alignment, we mean the smallest persistent homology distance. So we consider you've got your shape here, another shape here, and I could align them any kind of way, and for every alignment I compute the distance and I just take the minimum. Okay? So here I said rigid motions, which means you couldn't reflect, but there's no reason why you couldn't change that to be any other kind of group. you wanted, okay? This is unfortunately rather computationally expensive here we would still have to also approximate by some subset, not obviously every possible rotation. So we did this for a 2D example. And so the example we had was some standard silhouettes from a silhouette database. And the thing we were interested is in the boundary. So just think of that sort of circle that is bounding each of these shapes. So each of these rows corresponds to a different sort of class of objects, but they're not perfectly aligned. You know, some of them seem to be in the right alignment, but some of them are rotations of what they should be. Okay? And we also would like to compensate for, you know, size as well. So we normalize by size. Okay, and I'm not going to go into detail about that. We centered by using the center of the shape. And then we just rotated a bunch of different times and took the minimum distance over all the rotations. Okay, and we used the circle and used the distance between the bounding circles. Again, using the 0th dimensional one. So this is another MDS plot to try and see what this sort of distances look like. And the different colors correspond to the different rows, different classes, and there's also little letters next to them to describe. So the ones down the bottom were the glasses, the bones up the top, the blacks are forks, the greens are fountains, the axes, the keys, and the hearts. And you can see they kind of cluster. The forks are a bit weirder, but also if you look at the forks, they're a bit weird. I don't have the 2D one as well, but it doesn't show it there so much because it's being projected into 3D space, and obviously this is an infinite dimensional thing. But if you take the closest neighbor as a guess for who you are, you get it right most of the time, which is what you would hope. Okay, so this was next one's the motivating example. So here are the bones, or pictures of some bones. So these are physical bones that were scanned by a machine, and then there's a CT scanned image of it, triangulated. Somebody else has already done that. One of Doug's PhD students just wrote his thesis about aligning them, so they were aligned. And so we just used the definition straight ahead and sort of wanted to compare the kind of results we got to other things that his lab had already done. Okay, so the one in the middle is the thing we did. The one on the front was the manually placed, this is point A, this is point B process. And the last one here is the sort of analysis you do if you've got these places, but they had an automatic way of putting the landmarks up. So these two were automated, and that's expert. And the thing that is nice about the method we had in comparison to the others is that it split the different sort of subclasses within the evolutionary tree into the different things. So the grey ones and the red ones, and I'm really sorry to anyone who's colorblind, are the most primitive taxa, so think lemurs. The blue and the black and the light blue, they're the monkeys, and the green are the apes. And so we kind of split into these three groups better than the other methods. And you would like to think that the shapes of the heel bones was related to whether you were, you know, monkey, more primitive sort of primate, or hominid. Another application I wanted to bring your attention to is some stuff that was done which was a slight variation on a theme. They took the Euler characteristic transform and they kind of smoothed it a bit. So they weren't quite the Euler characteristic curves, but they were like a convolved version almost. And then they used that to try and, I think they put it with some machine learning, to be able to predict things about the disease using the shape of the tumors. So you had tumors in your head, and then you want to know things like how long before you relapse. And I stupidly asked Anthea, oh, so how many of them are still alive? You know, which ones are still alive? Oh, no, they're all dead. But do you die in 1 year or do you die in 5 years? That's the question. And it seemed to do better than some other methods at these kinds of predictions. How much longer have I got?
5 minutes.
5 minutes. Okay, so in this 5 minutes, yep, that's it. I wanted to just briefly mention some sort of more recent progress, not yet on the archive, not published, still being fixed for grammar. Results that Justin and Cheyenne I got about sort of injectivity results. So, and I'm going to be suitably vague here because nobody wants to know all the little constants. But for M finite simplicial complex, in R to the D, so if I know it's a finite simplicial complex in R to the D, then finitely many directions are enough to determine the whole thing. Okay. The number of directions you have, we have a very bad, stupid bound on, and I'm sure could be improved. But it's certainly you can figure out the whole thing from finitely many of them. And how many you need will depend upon geometric properties of the simplicial complex. But this shouldn't be a huge surprise, because there's finite information to discover. So I guess I should put the other one is, so I'm going to put a little generic proviso in there without describing it, but let's think of most shapes as sort of being generic. If M1, M2 generic. Oh, well, okay. I'll be more precise. Okay, so if M1, M2 finite simplicial complexes in R to the 3, whose vertices are in generic position, are in general position. That's fine. So that's my and I'm wanting to also assume that the Euler characteristic curves are unique for each direction, which I'm not certain if that comes automatically from the general position or not. This is a potential improvement. And maybe also need to assume. And ECT or S2 to the Euler characteristic curve, sublevel sets, whatever. Then the distributions are enough. So if the distribution of the persistence diagrams for M1 and M2 are the same, then one is a rotation or reflection combination of the other. Okay, then the distribution of PHT M1 equals the distribution of PH M2 implies there exists something in O3 such that M2 equals X of M1. So by distribution of diagrams, I mean is we had a function that went from the sphere to persistence diagram spaces if I forgot the directions, if I just remembered the image with like the push forward of the measure in the space of persistence diagram. So if I have this measure here and a measure here, if those measures are the same, then up to alignment, they're the same shape. Yeah, so that's it.
Thank you.
Questions or comments?
I might have missed it. So I saw you saying it's injective, meaning if the two shapes are equal, then the persistent transform is they're the same.
Other direction. If the persistent transforms are the same, then the thing,
In all
then the
directions. The question is, do you have a result that the distance difference, if they're slightly different,
Mhm.
then the persistent transform is also slightly different?
So it depends what your definition of slightly different is.
Right.
Okay? If you have something that's Gromov-Hausdorff close, then you haven't got a hope in hell. Because you could add a little bubble like this. The persistent homology of this and the persistent homology of that are very far apart. So that's the wrong kind of thing. My conjecture is that if you were to take suppose you had a hypersurface. My conjecture is, this is conjecture, is that if you perturbed by some sort of nice function from on the unit vector field on your hypersurface, then they would be close. But I haven't proved that. So no, I guess we don't have stability results along those lines. I would be very surprised if it wasn't true. Yeah.
Follow-up question. So you actually had experiments comparing when you fix landmarks. Maybe, a very expensive experiment you can try is actually compute pairwise distance between two shapes. It sounds like.
Well, the problem is, what do you mean by pairwise distance between two shapes? There are many ways to define what that should be. I mean, this is one way. Another way is to look at the
Nearby, the shot.
yes, so I mean that's sort of like Procrustes, take the whole shape. But then do you care about that as a measure? Are you looking at the Wasserstein distance of the measure that is the shape? Or, if I have a lump somewhere, if it's sort of got more mass somewhere, does that become a different shape? Does that make sense? Like it's a little unknown, there are other definitions where they look at conformal maps between the two things and minimize certain properties of these conformal maps. So there hasn't been that much done comparing the different options. You have the distances that Jacek talked about his, where they kind of did that distance, but they looked at the group, that frustration. There's almost too many choices. So that's why we added another. Precisely. Sorry.
So when you're computing these transforms, like in a computer lab for a calculation, you have to pick some finite number of directions, right?
Yes. Well, that's what we did. The way we picked the directions was I'm going to forget the name of this platonic solid. It's the largest platonic, the most sided platonic solid you've got in the sphere, and then I did a barycentric subdivision of that to make it finer. But there are lots of different ways of making grids on a sphere that you could use instead. I remember giving this talk and someone from numerical analysis said, oh, but you should be sampling more in areas where it's more uncertain and weighting appropriately. I mean, there's much more sophisticated things you could do.
So that was sort of my question, is like, what's the smartest way of picking these directions, right? And the smartest way would depend very much on the data set.
Yeah, so I mean, I would probably pick some subset, look at how much it was changing, and try to make sure that I picked more points where it seemed to be changing a lot to try and get a better guess and sort of, because although we have this sort of Lipschitzness, you could have more ambiguity in some areas than others where the shape is less flat. Yeah.
In have already answered this, but is there any reason why not use extended persistence?
There's no reason not to use extended persistence. Feel free.
So there is this work by Bologna group, Ferri, Rossini, Landi, about using the foliation method for reducing multidimensional Marshall distance to one-dimensional distances. Are you aware of the work? For multidimensional
Is this to do with you take lines in the parameter space?
value space.
In the value? I don't know enough about this work to be able to say something sensible.
Because I asked you this question before your talk.
Mm-hmm.
I realized that it's very similar.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe it's worth to look at it. And so they do, I think it's almost equivalent,
Mm-hmm.
except for technicalities. It's just that what they do, if you look at your integral, I think they are only interested in the directions in which all functions simultaneously increase.
Mm-hmm.
It's their partial order they use. So so if you
But-
translate it to your integral, the vectors v would be only those with positive coordinates.
So it's unclear whether or not, I mean, you would certainly lose information then.
Well, it's like you for one direction, when you count sphere, you count the height function and minus height function.
Mm-hmm.
So both.
Oh, I see.
Yes, so that's the difference. But except for this is very similar.
Mm-hmm. I'll have to read it.
They also have a problem with how to choose, how to choose the samples, how to interpret this.
For this finiteness result, is the number of finite directions you need to choose proportional to the number of simplices in the, is it equal to the number of simplices?
It's more proportional to the number of vertices. So there are three limiting factors, four limiting factors. One is in order to see a vertex, you can't have this to be too flat. So there has to be some parameter, some geometric parameter which cares about these sorts of angles. So I would like to say that I can see if I took this, I can see it from a range of angles. I can only see this vertex here kind of is a critical point for some range of directions. So I need to have something involving like that minimum size of the range of directions I'll see something in. So like if this has some sort of ball of radius delta that I can see that in, so that comes in. The dimension comes in that you lie in. So I care about this. I also care, you can care just about the number of directions, or you can get a better bound using the number of critical points in any given direction. So if I know that every direction has at most k critical points, then I can take some epsilon depending on delta, k, and d, take a net like this, and that will tell me, this will give me all the vertices by an appropriate algorithm. And then once I know all the vertices, I can supervisedly check this number of directions, which is a lot, in order to find the whole thing. Now this is more an existency thing than I recommend doing this many directions thing. But this here, this proof comes from the pigeonhole principle, which I love. There should be more pigeonhole principle in the world. And this aspect comes from the idea that when you look at your directions, you can sort of partition your sphere of directions into directions where you have sort of equivalence, like the same vertex will cause your critical points. I hope that vaguely answers your question.
Is there a way to characterize
If only. So my wish list includes that. What is the space of persistent homology transforms? You know, because it clearly lies inside persistence diagrams to something, to the D, but who knows, like there are consistency requirements, and I have no idea what they are. The other one is what can you say with a finite number of directions? And then the other one was the stability of it. They're my 3 wish lists.
Any more questions? You can ask Katharine in the tea break. However, don't forget about the dessert.
Oh yeah, I left it up.
4:30, the Italian group will be very entertaining with the software presentation. Thank you.